Hey y'all, this is Shon Gerber. Thanks for listening today, but before we get started, I wanted to update you on the launch of my CISSP Cyber Training membership for my listening audience. On March 5th, 2023, I began offering a monthly CISSP membership at 60% off my already low price. This is an introductory offer of $19 a month for the first year. With that insanely inexpensive price, you will get all of my CISSP content, practice exam questions, all my current and upcoming curated content, and finally, me. As I'm growing my products and services for my site, you will be on the ground floor to take advantage of an offer that will never, ever come back again. So if you're planning on taking the exam in 2023, or if you want to learn more about cybersecurity, this will be the time to make a life and career-altering decision for you and your family. This amazing offer is only available for the next 2 weeks, so I highly recommend that you don't delay and sign up today. All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Reduce Cyber Risk and CISSP Training Podcast, where we provide you the training and tools you need to pass the CISSP exam the first time. Hi, my name is Shon Gerber, and I'm your host for this action-packed, informative podcast. Join me each week as I provide the information you need to pass the CISSP exam and grow your cybersecurity knowledge. All right, let's get started. Giddy up. Hey, y'all, it's Shon Gerber with Reduce Cyber Risk. How are you all doing? Hope things are going well in your world. Life is great here in the wonderful state of Kansas, and I could not ask for anything better other than the summer is now starting to wind down, and we're rolling into fall, which is my most favorite time of the year. I love the fall. So call it crisp and cool and all that stuff, but as time goes on, things just seem to get busier and busier. But so I apologize for a little bit of a delay with Reduce Cyber Risk. We've been having some challenges that we've been working through here at the home front as it relates to my wife's business. So it's been a bit of a delay, and probably have a few more delays as we move forward here just into the fall, but then that'll speed up and we'll be able to stay pretty consistent with Reduce Cyber Risk podcast around helping you pass the CISSP the first time. And that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to help you pass that doggone test the first time. So other than that, life is good and I cannot complain at all. So let's get started into what we're going to talk about today. And today is Domain 2 Asset Security. And it's around understanding the different data states and protecting the assets within your environment. And so as you're looking at this from the CISSP standpoint, you got to figure out what are they asking for from the test and what should I plan for? Well, data states, there's the different ways the data is sitting within your environment. And it comes down to either data at rest, data in transit, or data in use. Now, I'll tell you about a misnomer. They talk about it a lot as far as online as what we should be concerned about with as it relates to data at rest, in that it is actually sitting on servers, laptops, USB devices, and so forth. Now, let's be honest. Data at rest, it's very rarely is it ever at rest, because it's always in constant state of movement. Steve Gibson from Security Now talked about this as well, in that it's important for you to understand the data itself is almost never at rest. It's always being used, it's always being modified, it's always in some level of flux as it is being utilized within your environment. So as you're dealing though with data at rest, what is sitting on your server? What is sitting on your laptop? What are on those USB devices? And so therefore you need to understand if it does get compromised or breached, how are you going to handle it? And we're going to get into a little bit further in the podcast about managing this data. From InfoSec Institute had a good article about that, and we'll kind of get into some of the details around managing your data as it sits on these devices. Now, as you're protecting the confidentiality of this data, it's important for you to use certain types of protection mechanisms. Now, you have access controls that can restrict it, but in many cases, as it's sitting at rest, that the access controls would be one piece. Another one would be strong levels of encryption. Now, the encryption that comes into play here would be encryption that you would get their AES 256 type encryption, and whether you're not that you are actually looking to protect it the best way you possibly can. Now, as you get more into the cloud environment, there's different levels of protection you can add and different levels of encryption. Now, pretty much the standard fare at this point is AES 256, but there are other ways that you can put other encryption strengths and ciphers you can put in place on your data. Now, something to consider that you may want to deal about is if you're going to be encrypting your data, do you put it to a standard such as the FIPS 140-2? That is something that is important to consider in whether or not you want to put it at that level of encryption for your specific data. Now, the access controls also are extremely important. As you're looking to ensure who has access to your information, these access controls will be vital. And the CISSP talks about that. What are you putting in place to protect your data? Either access controls or an encryption methodology. Now, examples of it, as far as we deal with the data at rest, we talked about encrypting the data in the database tables. It's also when you're dealing with data in transit, what can you do to protect the data between the 2 points? Typically, this would be HTTPS, which would be your level of encryption that you would put on your data as it's transferred through the web. And that's encryption between points. Your data in use. Do you have applications that you're utilizing the data that are in memory? Do you have ways for them to be protected while in memory, or are they deleted once they are no longer being used within memory? Okay, handling of sensitive data, there's various labels that can be put in place. And these labels are extremely important in the fact that what they can do is they can give you some guidance around what is the data that's sitting on these systems. Is it top secret? Is it secret? Is it unclassified? Or is it just sensitive? Is it IP? Is it high IP? Is it low IP? What kind of protections do you want to put around it is based a lot upon the labels that you add to it. You will document and manage this plan based on what you come up with, and it's important that you understand what is the data sitting in these systems. Now, as you're marking your sensitive data, the data classification is a key aspect and is a very important part of your overall plan within your organization. And I talk about this, I'm talking from a business standpoint, but as you're taking the CISSP, these are key questions they're going to ask you, is how do you protect your data? And I come back to a friend of mine who once said, he says, if you don't know what your data is, how can you protect it? And he also made a comment of, it's all about the data. So if you consider that as you're looking to take the CISSP, always remember this point. It's always all about the data. So if you're going to protect it, which way should you protect it? But at the same time, adding protections to these systems does add overhead. And therefore, if it adds that overhead, it also will cost you stuff, right? It'll cost you something. It'll cost you money. It'll cost you time. How do you want to handle it? And you may be overprotecting data that you don't necessarily need to do. So that's why it's important that you're marking sensitive data in a way that will help you protect your information the best way it possibly can. Now, physical labels, we talked about this a little bit. You can have a physical label on a system itself, which would be unclassified, secret, top secret, confidential, or it could be high IP, it could be whatever you want to call it. And that's the information that you would put specifically on the label you'd put on the device and or the hardware that you're utilizing. You could be as simple as putting it on a screen. There's different ways you can do it. You can now there's great products out there such as Microsoft has got Azure labels. It's got Azure IP. There's other different DLP, which is your data loss prevention type products that can help you put labels on it from a data standpoint or from what do you want to call it? Basically a software level. This could be as simple as putting it into the code that you write, but it also could be a sticker that you put specifically on the drive or on the computer that you're dealing with. So this is really important piece. The other thing to do is color code these and to include the name that you may have. This may be the simple situation where you color code a color of your IP as yellow or red or green, depending upon the classification of this data. You also can have a watermark, which would be a name or a footer or a header that you would have in your data as well. And all of these things can be put in place to help protect the information. So those are examples that you can put around marking your sensitive data. But I would stick with a standard type of nomenclature, a standard type of naming convention that you want to put in place for marking of your sensitive data. Don't go with something crazy and exotic. Stick with something simple. And I always kind of go back to is keep it simple, stupid. The more simple, see, that's the good third grade language coming out. The more simple you can make it, the better off you will be. Also, document the procedures on how you want to upgrade, downgrade all of this data from a sensitivity standpoint. So one of the pieces that comes into play here is if you do upgrade or downgrade your data, that's something that was sensitive is no longer sensitive, you need to have a good process in place on how to actually document that. You also need to look at transferring your data. How do you document the transfer of it from one party to a next? So I've seen situations where you're going to be sending information to somebody that is in, I don't know, a different state, different company. You need to document how do you best do that. And it needs to be also in a simple format and easy to understand and deal with. So that's an important part of all this, is just, again, document, keep it simple, and make sure that people understand all of it that goes into it. Also, destroying sensitive data. It's extremely important that you destroy this data after a period of time. You don't want this data to be lingering out there. What is your plan around destroying the data? So it's important that you document all of this, from upgrading and downgrading, transferring it, and destroying of the sensitive data. All these pieces are a critical part of your security program, and they're a critical part of how you set up for your CISSP exam, because they're going to ask you these questions. How are you going to do it? Do you have a process for upgrading and downgrading your sensitive data? Do you have a way of documenting how you're going to transfer your sensitive data and or store it as well, or I should say destroy it? So those are all key aspects that you need to consider around documenting these procedures as it relates to marking your sensitive data. Okay, so we're dealing with another aspect is scoping and tailoring. Now, scoping sets a baseline security controls that are in place, and you want to set your scope around what do you want to protect and how do you want to mark this labeling. And if you don't set this baseline around your security controls, it basically ends up happening is it gets to be too large around dealing with the information. And so therefore you need to set the baseline security controls in place. And understand that these controls apply also to IT as well, which are information technology people. Now, as an example, a system allows for only one RDP or remote desktop session. You may have that in place that you're going to have those security controls that only one RDP session can be connected at any one given time. You also may decide there's no need for more controls around remote access. You may not want any more controls around. You may want to keep it wide open. But those are pieces that you need to consider as you're looking at tailoring your security plan to your organization. Another thing around tailoring is a list of controls that align baseline organizations. So you may have an organization that's set up, and you may want to baseline the controls to be similar across your entire company or across your entire group. Now, you need to understand, though, that what is the risk tolerance for that organization? Now, that could be in a situation where you're dealing with nuclear power plants, for an example. Their risk tolerance is much lower than the risk tolerance for a large company that may just deal with some sort of widget that really doesn't have any value. It's just like, let's say, toilet paper, for an example. There is some controls around the fact that you don't want to have someone get remote access to your systems that could hurt people, but at the end of the day, you may not have a lot of data that is sensitive because it's just making toilet paper. I don't know. It depends on the situation where maybe your comparative advantage and your competitive advantage is set up so that this data is extremely proprietary to making toilet paper. So one set of toilet paper to the next person's set of toilet paper could change that. So therefore, you may need to consider that situation. However, the bottom line is that you need to look at the risk tolerance for your organization, and you need to set a minimum security standard for your company. Now, this comes down to the CISSP. They're going to ask you around setting a minimum security standards for your company. Now, these can be based on various solutions that are out there in various frameworks. The NIST 800 series has a great set of standards and frameworks that you can use to help you meet your minimum security standards. Now, standard selections, this can be done in different ways as well. This can be based on internal or external needs of your organization. This could be GDPR, China cyber law, PCI DSS. Any of these organizations or any of these different situations could determine what are the standards that are set for your company. That not all standards may apply. So as an example, let's say you don't have business in China, you're only in South America. Well, then those standards, the Chinese standards, would not apply to your company. But you may have South American standards that would apply, so therefore you would want to follow those. If you're transferring data between the EU and your South American business, you would now have the South American standards plus the European Union or their GDPR standards that would also affect you. Now, as we deal with Brexit and all the things that roll into Brexit, it'll be really interesting to see how that changes the environment, and if it does. And we've been talking about Brexit with the EU or with the UK for quite some time, so it'll be interesting interesting to see how that actually plays out in the coming 6 to 12 months. Now, as you're using defined standards are extremely useful, even if they're not required. They follow many of the same principles that, whether it's a standard that deals with your GDPR or what it deals with in your company, but they do follow many of the exact same principles within from one standard to the next. So it's important to pick a standard and follow that standard, because it will pay off for you in dividends. Now, there's various data protection methods. This would be data loss prevention software, and there are various products on the market. We kind of talked about this a little bit with Azure IP. Now, that data loss prevention could be set up so that it's within the application itself. And these products would be your labels of high IP, low IP, business confidential. You can define some of those, what they are. It could be secret, top secret, super top secret, whatever you want to call it. But you can define many of these labels within your organization. The challenge is sometimes you may have to stay standardized with those depending upon the data loss prevention software. Or you could get very organizational specific potentially. So whatever it is though, keep it simple. Do not get it over complex. The more complex you make it, guess what will happen? Either it'll get so bad that it will protect everything and it'll cause all kinds of disruptions within your organization, or it'll be overly complex and people just won't use it. So that's something to consider if you're looking to put some level of DLP into your environment. Now, you also use these labels which add meta tags to your applications that you're utilizing. Now, the data protection methods also prevent documented procedures around transmitting sensitive data. This would be file transport protocols, email for transport, and USB sticks. These procedures can be put in place. Now, we talk a lot about USB, and many people think, well, hey, you can't use USB if you're going to be protecting your data. That's not the case. I still use USB sticks in certain situations within our organization. The difference is, though, is there's a FIPS standard. When we talked about this at the beginning of this series, it's around a 140-2 series. So there's a 140, 141, 140-2, 140-3. But bottom line is, which series do you want to use to protect the security or protect the data that you're storing on these USB sticks? And basically what it does, it puts a level of encryption to protect the data. In the event that it is lost, what happens to that information? So these are really important for in defining this policy that you do utilize these USB sticks within your organization. Now, the storing of sensitive data, we talked about encryption, access controls, and then finally, one thing I'd like to add to that is logging and monitoring. How do you monitor and log what happens to these sticks? Because it's important that you're watching all of that information. And then when you're dealing with the actual storing of sensitive data, how do you at the end destroy it or deletion of the data? It's important that you define these processes out and you make sure that this is all put in place so that you understand, along with the individuals within your organization, how to walk through each of these areas and each of these aspects. Okay, also, as we get into the next area, we're going to talk about InfoSec Institute. And it's a great article they had out there around managing data. But before we do, we want to talk a little bit about going to ShonGerber.com and checking out some of the free stuff I've got available for you at my website. And you need to go and check it out. There's basically my domain. I've got some great sample stuff around domain 1 through 4 for the CISSP exam, and we have great video training that's available to you by going to ShonGerber.com. And again, that's ShonGerber.com, and you can get some great free stuff out there for you. So I definitely need to go check it out if you're looking to take the CISSP exam and you want to pass it the first time. Okay, so let's get into the InfoSec Institute and what they talk about. And they're going to get into managing data. And by managing this data, we're going to be talking about marking, handling, storing, and the destruction of sensitive data. As we had talked about previously in the domain 2, in the asset handling aspect of this, this is a piece that InfoSec Institute came out around this, and this was an article that they put out talking about the difference of levels of managing data. And so some of this stuff you've already heard as it relates to what we've just talked about in the CISSP exam and what you need to know, but we're going to kind of cover a few little things in there that I think are kind of additive to what we are trying to accomplish as it relates to managing of data. Now, what they talk about as well is breaches. You know, one of the things that we talk to in relates to data, in the fact that if you manage this data and you control this data, the purpose of this is to to avoid or limit the risks of a data breach and how that may affect your company. So as you're taking the CISSP, the ultimate goal is that you are going to be a security professional within an organization. And if you're going to be the security professional within a company, you're going to need to understand that you want to avoid a data breach, right? That's imperative that you do that. And so but the bottom line is that there's probably going to be at some point in time in your career, you're going to have to deal with a data breach, and you're going to have to go through all of the nuances to make sure that it's best protected. So as they're talking about the managing of the data, you need to avoid data breaches at all costs. And then one of the things that comes into with around the effects of a data breach would be the loss of market share or reputational hit for your company. This also can deal with fines and other penalties that you can experience in the event of an actual data breach. So it's important that you do have a plan in place to deal with this. And this would be an incident response plan, along with how do you have access controls in place to control or limit what an intruder may get of your data. Now, the official guide of the CISSP talks about the logical and physical controls such as marking, handling, storing, and declassification provide methods for secure handling of sensitive data. And so that's what you got to deal with, and that's what you got to understand as it relates to the CISSP exam. So you need to ensure that all classified data is marked to address the final thing, these few things. You got mandatory access controls and you got discretionary access controls. Now, we talked about what is a mandatory access control. Well, when I was a previous life in the military, we had various levels of controls that we had to deal with. You had your unclassified, you had your secret, you had your top secret. Those are the key big drivers that you had within your organization, within the military. Now, there are other levels of classification, but those were the big three buckets that you had to deal with. Now you have discretionary access controls, and majority of the organizations will use discretionary access control, which is DAC, DAC, Delta Alpha Charlie, versus the MAC, which is your mandatory access controls, or your Mike Alpha Charlie. Now the mandatory access controls, again, were unclassified, secret, top secret, okay? But when you're dealing with discretionary access controls, those are ones that you put in place from an organizational standpoint. Now, another thing to consider, we talked about with markings, how important markings are within your company. And in the fact that when you're dealing with digital marks, it could be, and marks could be a label of some kind. They could be a digital mark, i.e. they're in the header, the footer, they're in some level of the application when it boots up, or they could be more of a actual physical label that you would have, that you'd put in place. And we had talked about previously whether you're dealing with a yellow marker for a certain type of security background, or I should say a yellow sticker, or a red sticker based on another security background. The different colors mean different things, so that you can go and you can see these from a distance and understand what is the security level of these systems. But again, they will vary in forms and nature, depending upon what you're trying to accomplish. And again, the CISSP is going to get into this. It's going to ask you what kind of digital marks or labels would you be dealing with within your organization. Now, there's media containing sensitive data should be managed and based on the sensitivity of the data. Again, we've talked about this and it makes common sense, but at the end of the day, it's all about the data. And if the data is sensitive and it's being managed that way, then you need to make sure that you put the proper controls in place to deal with that. Now, they had put up a couple, InfoSec article had brought up a couple different examples, and these are from 2012. But you can look in today's world in 2019 and still see some of these same things. TD Bank displays 2 backup tapes with customer data. Okay, so how do they handle that, right? Do you have encryption in place if you lose those tapes? Well, that stinks. However, we have encryption in place to deal with it. 2012, they have Cattle's Group, which was personal loans, 2 unencrypted backup tapes that were there. 2012, TRICARE, which is really near and dear to my heart, lost backup tapes on healthcare items for personnel. And bottom line is these tapes get lost. They can get destroyed, whatever it may be. They get legs and they move. And so therefore you need to make sure that there is some level of protection in place on this data. Because if not, what happens if it's exposed? You now deal with all the issues that go with that. Another thing to consider is the recommendations for handling of data. This would be only designated employees should have access to the sensitive data specifically. And there should be policies and procedures on how to handle this sensitive data should it be shared or exposed to the world. There should be regular training sessions, should be institutionalized, so that you have that in place for individuals and how they should understand this information. And never, ever, as a security person, assume that everyone is fully aware and comprehends all the security measures associated. They just don't. There's too many moving parts, and people have a comparative advantage that they study and they know what they do. An accountant is really good at being an accountant. However, he or she may not understand totally the cybersecurity nature of the entire event. So never assume that everyone is fully aware and comprehends all the security measures in place. Now, layered protection is vital. Data should be encrypted at rest at all times. Again, as we talk about with the breaches of the loss of data from the backup tapes. If the data is encrypted while it's at rest, so it's sitting in these backup tapes, it is well protected. It should be looking at if the data is in transit, leaving from one location to another, it should be encrypted. There also should be consider a layered approach to what is necessary. Controls and protections should be in place in the event something leaves your organization. And then adequate training for all employees. And this comes down to, this training can be as simple as just a one-page sheet with maybe a video. And you don't have to go in depth. Again, keep it simple. Little bite-sized pieces of information are extremely valuable and important to companies. Recommendations on storing data. Do not store where someone can just pick it up and walk off with it. Again, don't just leave it out and about for someone just to grab. Backup media should be encrypted and in a fire-resistant box. So in the event that something does happen, it's in a situation where it can just be grabbed and you can go with, or it can be protected in the event that there's a fire. Because if not, and you have a fire and it burns everything up and you lose all of your data, well, what's the point there? Hence, this is why dealing with Amazon, AWS, or other cloud providers can provide you the backup kind of protections that you would really be helpful for your organization. Store encrypted data in an offsite location. And this could be as simple as Amazon AWS, or it could be an actual physical location where you take your data every day to a different backup site, an offsite location. Now, access limits should be and separations of duties should be enforced. So in the fact that you have Fred, who's working with you, decides to move on to a new company. As he moves on to this new company, he finds that he still has access into your environment. Well, those should be limited. So he should have access limits based on what he or she can do, and there should be a separation of duties. So therefore, Bill doesn't have access to everything. Another thing that ends up happening in this space is what a person will move within the same company. So you'll stay in company A, but you move to different roles within that company. As you move to these different roles, what happens in many cases? The access will go with you. And so therefore you start off with a certain level of access, but as you've been with this company 5, 10, 15 years, all of a sudden this level of access goes up dramatically. Now, as you're looking at the different aspects around record retention, there needs to be a process around the preservation and maintenance of this valuable information. What are you going to do to keep it? Now, there could be a couple reasons behind this. It could be legal reasons, it could be personal reasons, or it could be you're a hoarder. So it depends upon the situation. But as you deal with record retention, there needs to be a process around the preservation and maintenance of this information. So again, I'm talking about a couple processes here, but if you do, there's like 5 or 6 main ones. If you do those, that'll dramatically reduce what's going on within your company and the risk to your company. So again, you need to deal with how are you going to maintain this data? How are you going to transfer this data? How are you going to destroy this data? Those are some key pieces. And then you need to work with your legal team to ensure that it meets all of their requirements as well. Now, there's different types of retention. There's a hardware retention, which typically is the 3 to 5 years devices become obsolete and they need to be replaced. But then there's personal type of information. They're what they retain in people's brains, and that is basically based on NDAs. Or that's how you protect that, is through an NDA. Now, hardware aspects is that you're dealing with switches, routers, databases. You can protect those in various ways and processes. So include, let's say you have a database and that database goes end of life and you have to replace it. Well, you can degauss it, you wipe the data, degauss it, and or destroy the data, destroy the system itself, and that's usually about 3 to 5 years. Or you can have it set up where a person is with your organization, and within they're looking to leave. Well, they have to sign NDAs in place that they don't disclose any of this information to anybody else. So those are different types of retention that you can have within your company. Now, those are the big things we want to get around with asset, or I should say domain 2 around assets, and so asset protection. So now we want to deal with the questions. What are some key questions that you can understand as it relates for your CISSP? All right, so what is considered proprietary information? Okay, A, asset information, or which would be an IP or MAC address, address information, biometric data, or data related to physical characteristics of an image. And again, these questions come from InfoSec Institute. B, source and object code, copyright materials, engineering drawings, algorithms, schemes, flowcharts, process of manufacturing, marketing, trade secrets, pricing, and financial data. C, social security numbers, driver's license, health data plans, medical record numbers, names of relatives, IP addresses, images, and biometric data. So again, what is considered proprietary information? And that would be B, source and object code, copyright materials, engineering drawings, algorithms, schemes, flowcharts, process of manufacturing, marketing, trade secrets, pricing, and financial data, etc. Those are all pieces around proprietary information. 2, according to the official CISSP materials, what is considered a type of retention? A, customer retention. B, personal retention or personnel retention. C, data retention. D, waste retention. E, hardware retention. According to the official CISSP materials, what is considered a type of retention? Personnel retention, data retention, waste retention, or hardware retention. As we're dealing with this, there are 2 types that we talked about today: personnel retention and hardware retention. Okay, now you may have data retention requirements and waste retention requirements, but what we talked about today was personnel retention and hardware retention. Why is it deemed to be bad practice when companies tailor their retention schedule based on the longest retention period they identify, applying it as a cure-all to all retention records? So again, why is it deemed to be a bad practice when companies tailor their retention schedule based on the longest retention period they identify, apply as a cure-all to retention records? Basically, set the retention schedule based on a long time so that you can just cover everything, okay? But why is this a bad practice? A, it consumes much space. C, it creates significant noise in cases of employees search or process records. And C, it may increase in exposure to legal liabilities. Or D, all of the above. Again, so what is a bad practice for keeping everything forever? That's basically what the question's asking. Again, that's the other thing you have to do with the CISSP is get good at understanding and deciphering what they're actually meaning. And basically what it comes down to is A, or I should say A. Don't listen to that. D, all of the above. It consumes space, it creates significant noise, and it may increase your exposure to legal liability.
Thanks so much for joining me today on my podcast. If you like what you heard, please leave a review on iTunes, as I would greatly appreciate your feedback. Also, don't forget the 60% off my membership at CISSP will be ending on the 19th of March. So sign up today for this once-in-a-lifetime sales event. Thanks again for listening. See ya.
Hey, thanks again for listening today. It's been my pleasure to prep you for the CISSP exam. Are you interested, though, in some free CISSP exam questions? Head on over to freecisspquestions.com and sign up to join my email list, and you'll receive access for 60 free CISSP questions each and every month for the next 6 months. That's a total of 360 questions just for signing up with CISSP Cyber Training. You'll also gain access to other free CISSP resources, so just head on over to freecisspquestions.com and sign up, or head on over to CISSPcybertraining.com and sign up today. Have a wonderful day, and we will catch you on the flip side. See ya.